To both Father Luke and Father Ted, and I know Father Barnabas, thanks for allowing me to share the stage with you. I now ask all of you for some patience and forgiveness. I'm going to condense a very broad and a very deep range of thoughts into a very short presentation. And so what I hope to do is to stimulate you and to excite you about a journey, and, if you will, to get you to begin to ask questions and question things. And I also hope that as I speak, you'll recognize Father Evan has distilled some fairly large concepts down, and in condensing them, I've obviously oversimplified them. Yet, my goal is to provide you with some actionable and tangible things to do once you return to your parishes, so I think you should listen carefully. Now, don't get discouraged or attempt, got to learn how to use my clicker. Don't get discouraged or attempt everything I'm suggesting at once. I, for the last year or so, have been meeting privately with a leadership trainer, a corporate coach, and he told me one time, you can't eat a salami in one sitting, but rather you have to eat it one slice at a time. So as I present these ideas, I'm hoping that I'm going to give you an idea of what to do when you get back, but don't attempt to do it all at once. One last introductory remark. I hope, like His Eminence said last night, that you will understand that my comments come across in a spirit of love and understanding. I love the church, and I want to see it thrive. And I'm so incredibly nervous to be up here, because this is important. It's so important that we get this right. So I'm going to start with telling you a story. Have you seen this picture before? I love this picture. As a newly ordained priest some 15 years ago, I remember attending my first ever clergy laity congress, and it was for my metropolis. And I was particularly excited because I was part of the host parish, and with Father Luke Christopoulos, we were tasked with organizing this gathering, and so I was part of the planning. And that was exciting for me. But there was an additional thing that was happening. There was a priest who had served for 20-plus years as an Anglican priest who had converted to Orthodoxy and was coming to the conference now as a newly ordained Orthodox priest. That was a new thing for me. And I had not yet met a clergyman who had converted. And I know that word convert is controversial. We can use revert, retread, whatever you want to use. But nevertheless, when he got there, the first event that we had was a gathering with Metropolitan Isaiah, and it was a business meeting for just clergy. And we sat in there for 2.5 hours going over forms. Minor details. Now, Father Luke Yule, who was our chancellor, if you know him, he's a detail guy. So he was PowerPoint, laser, on line 3 of your baptismal forms, what I need you to do. And this went on. We talked about total commitment. I mean, it was just dreadful. And I thought to myself, what is this priest going to think? I was worried about him. And so after the meeting, in the hallway, I sheepishly went up to him and introduced myself. I said, well, Father so-and-so, what do you think? Welcome to the Greek Orthodox Metropolis. What do you think? What are your first impressions? He grabbed my hand and he looked me in the eye and he said, well, I have to tell you, that was the best clergy meeting I ever attended. And I thought, is he crazy? I said to him, Father, are you kidding me? We just spent 2 hours going over forms and budgets and details. And he said, yes! But you have to understand that as an Anglican clergyman, I spent the last 30 years defending the divinity of Christ, the purpose of the Eucharist. And none of this is up for debate in the Orthodox Church. Why did I choose to begin my talk with the story? Well, I want to reassure you that nothing I'm going to talk about touches upon the deep theological and eternal truths about being Orthodox. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about forms, budgets, and menial details. Let me tell you another story. In 1985, I was a 10th grader at Overland High School. And that January, on the 28th, 1986, as we started our second semester, the school was brought into the gym for an all-school event. We were there to watch the Space Shuttle's launch. The name of the Space Shuttle was the Challenger. And if you recall, 73 seconds into the 25th Space Shuttle mission, it all ended in a terrible disaster. Mission Control reported, as it blew apart on the screen, obviously a major malfunction. And after our country did a lengthy and in-depth review of what happened, it determined that a relatively small and inexpensive part was the cause of one of our nation's greatest and most costly space program disasters, the now infamous O-ring. Remember that? Well, as I said, we're not going to talk about the eternal truths of the Orthodox Church. Those aren't up for debate. We know that the Church is the ark of salvation, that it's effective and unchanging. And so, if you will, the hardest part, like Father so-and-so said, is settled. But, like the flight controller announced on that fateful day of the Challenger launch, we have the possibility of a major malfunction. And it's related to the O-ring, to how we go about our business, the details. So to help you understand this premise, I've entitled my talk, Overcoming Obstacles, Unlocking Your Parish's Potentials. Now, as a young business student in college, I remember studying a practice by McDonald's Corporation. McDonald's is doing well, right? They told us what they were doing on all their signs for a while. And I think, as Jerry Seinfeld said, they finally just gave up. We're doing great. We're not going to put up how many millions of burgers we're selling. But in their corporate stores, they had their corporate management trainees, switch locations for a period of 2 years while they went through their corporate training. They had to go to a different store, and their goal was to have them enter as many stores as possible before they graduated. The question is why? Now, the answer McDonald's gave was rather insightful. They noticed that new management trainees had the fresh eyes to see problems that established managers who had served for years in the same location no longer saw. If you will, it's a bit like the blind man in John, where the long-established religious leaders who were supposed to see and know who Jesus was could not. But the man born blind could. He had new eyes. So in a moment, you're going to begin to wonder, why is Father Evan not talking about outreach and evangelism? I am. Just not in the way that we traditionally think about it. My premise, and this is key to the rest of my talk, if you say, hey, he's off, you can just go. And I had a dream last night that everybody did after I got through the first few pages. They just walked out. I really did have the dream. So far, we're doing good. My premise is you don't need an outreach and evangelism program. Rather, the whole life of the church is just that. What you need to do is to peel away what is in the way of outreach and evangelism. It's a bit like how God himself works. He comes into the world, and he doesn't obliterate, but he restores the image of God in us. So I'm going to run through these quickly because the last two presenters did a great job. Let's just start with two facts that help us frame the conversation. The first fact is that God gives the growth. This is an important quotation from Mark chapter 4, verse 26 through 28. This is the Lord speaking. And he said, "The kingdom of God is as if a man should scatter seed on the ground and should sleep by night and rise by day, and the seed should sprout and grow. He himself does not know how." Now, what we're going to say works for every parish, whether you're big or small or old or new, a mission, struggling, dying, screaming off the launch pad, it doesn't matter. The Lord gives the growth. He wants his church to grow, both qualitatively and quantitatively. He's interested in numbers. and he causes it to happen. Now, the second fact is that our parishes aren't growing. Here's the actual statistics from the registry. So we see that in the last 15 years, a 22% decline. Very interesting. The number of funerals in that same period have increased 22%. And here's just another fact about just churches in America. 60% are 100 people or less, and the average size is 89. So what gives? You know, if God wants us to grow, and if we're not growing, then the question is, why not? And the only answer that I can come up with is we have erected barriers. We have gotten in the way. And our job then becomes to search for barriers, not implement growth strategies. So the quotation is, if we want to unlock the God-given potential in our communities, then we have to remove the obstacles that stand in the way. Don't ask, why are we not growing? God has already promised you that you will. But do ask, what keeps us from growing? And so I like to put it this way. In my parish, you have to develop vujade. Here's vujade. The feeling that you have looked at something many times, but now see it in a new way. If you remove barriers, your parish will grow healthy. And if your healthy parishes grow, they naturally grow. Father Jonathan Ivanoff isn't with us, but his booth is there, ONCD. There is data from 70,000 churches in America that confirms this fact. It's not just a hunch. So if we ignore this, then we're just going to chase our tails. So I'm going to run through this slide very quickly, and then we're going to take each of these bullets point by point. Now, before I get too far along, in your binders at the back, there's a pamphlet that I have on growth, things learned from a mission parish. Father Theodore and I could have written each other's presentations. It's almost identical. So I go through here, and just like a confession guide, you know, when you get ready for confession, you ask yourself a bunch of questions. Those questions stimulate thought. The thought gets you to reflect and come up with positive and life-changing ways to go about maybe a new paradigm. So, and the same thing's going on in here. But nevertheless, I'm not going to go through this. I've got a whole podcast and series on that brochure. What we're going to do is we're going to look at these various obstacles. Not why are we not growing, but what stands in our way. Preliminary obstacles. Soil hasn't been tilled, like I said. We're going to go through these one by one. Fear. Priest is the primary caregiver. 3 parish paradigms. Leadership progression. Lack of strategic plan. Lots of meetings. Lots of meetings. And events that go nowhere. And then some practical obstacles. So let's start with the first one. Tilling the soil. So the obvious connection here is the parable of the sower. We have to ask ourselves the question. Someone asked earlier, you know, what if my parish doesn't have people who are interested? Okay. Well, you can't just throw seeds out there if the ground is hard, can you? What will happen? They get eaten up. Or if the soil's not deep enough, they don't mature. Or if the ground is rocky, it's easily uprooted. So you've got to prepare the soil. Now, how do we do that? Well, I have to tell you that about 3-4 years ago, I went back to the parish that I first attended as a young child. It's an old Greek Orthodox church, venerable cathedral. And while I was in the fellowship hall, a little Greek lady that saw me grow up came up and said, "Oh, Father, so many years now I never see you." And I said, "Thank you, Kyrie Kula." She says, "How are you?" I said, "I'm very fine." She said, "Where are you now?" I said, "Oh, I'm in Loveland, Colorado." "Oh, you have church there?" I said, "Yeah, Saint Spyridon Greek Orthodox Church." "Any Greeks there?" I said, "No, not really." She said, oh, tell the bishop to close it. You see, our first problem is that we don't have a positive view of growth. We really don't. And as leaders in our communities, before we do anything, we've got to remove this barrier, and we've got to begin to develop a positive view in ourselves and in our communities and our community leaders of growth. What is growth? Do we have a positive view of it? The second thing is that with growth or health comes change. And so once again, do we have a positive view of that? You know, of course, there's that old joke. You know, how many Orthodox priests does it take to change a light bulb? Change? So we have to talk to our people about this. And the third thing is that when we begin to talk about growth and health and change, you've got to prepare everybody for the disturbance and turbulence that'll come. Father Ted, what happens? Every time we fold in new families, it shakes up the fabric of our communities. Now, a dear friend of mine, Father Tom Sagalaki, shared the image with me a while ago, and I didn't put the slide in. Have you ever seen a jet hit supersonic speed? You can Google the image. It's fantastic. But inside the cockpit, if you talk to a pilot and you ask him, what happens when you get close to the sound barrier? He goes, oh my gosh, everything inside the plane begins to shake. And the natural tendency is to throttle back. And so in flight school, one of the things they have to teach you is to throttle forward when you hit that moment. And that's very difficult in our communities because, you know, a positive view of growth and a positive view of change, and then saying, okay, when this starts to happen, a young man in my parish attended a big church in Atlanta. He was a college student. He got to know the parish, and during Holy Week was sitting in the front row with a group of Greek Orthodox ladies. And on Good Friday, he got to church late because he had classes, and he was standing at the back. And he noticed that this little old Greek lady was peering out the back, looking down the aisle, and I guess she was looking for him. And when she saw him, she waved him forward. And he was so excited, they saved his seat. He went up there, and he got in the pew, and he turned, and he said, thank you. She said, yeah, someone was sitting here, but I kicked him out. You know, my yaya had a big family, 7 children, and those children had lots of children. And, you know, my yaya didn't seat us in different rooms. She just set another table. They were different shapes and sizes. Didn't matter if you knew the rules, you got to sit at the table. And by sitting at the table, you learned. But you know what? We don't want to make room. So that turbulence is difficult, and we have to talk before with our communities about this reality. And the next slide. Oop, wrong direction. The next barrier that we've got to talk about in our communities is fear. And fear really equates to erecting all sorts of leadership barriers, especially in the community leaders. And what happens when we have fear? Oh, I don't know how to use this, Father Ted. The first thing is paralysis. You just don't do anything. And you probably have recognized this with fear. You stop doing anything. You just sort of hold on. You begin to do what Father Luke said. You have that inward focus. The second thing is uncontrolled or unexamined actions. You become a berserker. You just start making decisions, doing something. And it's not coherent. It's not defined. But you figure action is activity, so I'm just going to do it. Or you begin to misread or misinterpret cues. Nobody's in church. You don't know really why or understand what's happening in your community. And then what happens is because of fear, the leaders in our community become silent. They make excuses for what's going on. You see this as a depressed economy. You started just avoiding problems. What problem? The chanter? He's not a problem. You know, and they do that. It's not a problem, is it? I had a woman attend my church for the first time. She said, I didn't know Orthodox church music was beautiful. She thought that was how it was supposed to sound, right? We make excuses. We just avoid our problems. We blame or gossip. It's that priest. He's the problem. It's that parish council president. We get angry and we cheat. Fear presents all. So you've got to look at this and look in your communities and say, maybe you're here because you're afraid. Maybe you've got problems in your church, and so you thought, well, I'll go to this conference. They'll solve them. The next barrier that I think you've got to address is the priest as the primary caregiver. This is a huge barrier in most of our parishes. Now, I travel I do talks here and there, and I had invited a priest whose parish I'd visited to come to my parish, and he showed up early with me for Orthros, and when we got there, the church was already full of people. And he said, what's going on? So what do you mean? The doors weren't locked, the lights were on, the prospero was on the proskimi, tapers were lit, censer was going. He goes, what's happening? Is it a special feast day? I said, no. He says, what are all these people doing? I said, what do you mean? He says, you don't unlock the church and turn on the lights and light the censer? I said, no. Do you? He goes, I do everything. Right? Is that the way it works? Most of your churches? You know, he was shocked that people were engaged and involved. We're going to talk about how that happens a little bit later on. But what most of our parishes have is the priest as a primary caregiver. And there's two obvious limitations to that. The first is numerical. Father Theodore was talking about the numerical limit. And the numerical limit, it's a statistical fact, is 200. That's as many as you can have in your core with one primary caregiver. And for most people, it's closer to 125. If you have a really talented priest, he can get to 200. Okay? Past that, you get people on the periphery. Now, the second thing that happens is that you burn out the primary caregiver. You don't have to go far to hear a priest complain about his job. You know, my yaya used to call me and say, what do you do? And I say, what do you mean, yaya? She says, well, I know Sunday. You know that 8 to 10 window? I got that. But the rest of the time, what are you doing? With one primary caregiver, you cannot do effective outreach. You can't do evangelism. You can't instill spiritual health. The barrier prevents it. And as you ramp up the spiritual life of your parish, the model's not scalable. So we don't even have to talk about big numbers. We can just talk about big health. And if you got one primary caregiver, it's not going to happen. Now, when burnout comes into play, we see that the caregiver at some point gets to a threshold, and they just can't sustain everything. And then they do odd things. They drink. They become addicted to movie watching. They skip out on parish council meetings. All sorts of weird symptoms occur, right? And we see them throughout our archdiocese. Now, there are two not so obvious limitations. The first of them is not repeatable. My parish got really worried in the first few years, Father Evan, what happens if you go? You know, not every priest is going to work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Not every priest is a saint. They all have different talents. And so one of the not so obvious limitations to the priest as a primary caregiver is that it's not repeatable. So if your continued health, there's a great book out there called Good, Not Great. What's the title of that book? Good to Great. And he looks at sustained health in corporations. One of the things that they recognize is that you cannot have a single person being the primary motivator or caregiver. Over the long haul, you're going to see uneven health. You'll get to a parish sometimes, and they'll say, oh, when Father so-and-so was here, this place was rocking. And then Father, the guy that's here now, he showed up, and it's been a mess ever since. Right? It's very uneven. The other thing is that it eliminates meaningful engagement. And I should have really given this its own slide. You know, on the one hand, we have this problem where the priest is a primary caregiver, but we have similar barriers in other areas, whether that be administrative, ministry, decision-making. We have the life of the parish being controlled by just a few. And the remedy, and this is really important, as leaders, we have to develop leaders. That's our job. Christ developed 12. How many are you developing? And so if you move away from this idea of just a few primary caregivers, but rather identifying leaders in your community, then you begin to franchise or leverage the caregiving in your community. And once you and these new community leaders are developed, so we run a leadership class throughout the year. If you want to run a ministry in our parish, you have to take this leadership class. And there's levels. We're constantly developing the leaders. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but once you've developed these leaders and then you inoculate them with your vision and mission and goals and release them, then like that priest who showed up, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, look at all these people doing stuff. And you're not doing it. They're already doing it. If we continue to try to do it all by ourselves, we limit health. We burn out key personnel. We fail to achieve continued and sustained health and growth. It's not enough for Father Evan to show up and have this dynamic parish and then leave, and then it all falls apart, right? And we see that. We have vestiges of parishes that were really rocking for a while, and then they aren't anymore. Instead, when we remove this idea of the primary caregiver being the priest or a few people, then we get all the oars in the water. Do you know what I mean by that? If you're rowing crew? If one guy's rowing hard but the other 7 aren't, it doesn't work. Everybody's oar goes in. And do they have to go in at the same time? Yes. They're aligned around the same strategy. And this pushes our parishes to new levels of health, and then obviously, outreach and evangelism. So I'm going to give you one more way to think about this. 2 scenarios. Imagine that you're part of a disaster team, and so you see them loading up in their helicopter, helicopter A, helicopter B. You get in helicopter A, I get in helicopter B. You land on site. There's just been a terrible natural disaster. You get out, and the primary caregiver, the lead of your team, says, all right, here's the deal. See that house that just collapsed? We're going to go over there. We're going to remove the rubble. We're going to find out if there's any survivors. And so you get to work on the task. While you're doing that, the neighbor comes over and says, hey, my house just collapsed. When you're done, could you come over there? Now, meanwhile, there's 300 homes that have collapsed. You get what's going to happen here? And you just go from one task to the next. So you're on task. Second team arrives. They land. They see the same natural disaster. I get out of the helicopter. My team's ready to go. I say, no, stop. We're not going to that house. But Father, there are people inside. We need to go. No. You're going to work on a feeding program. You're going to work on a water program. You're going to work on shelter. I'm on strategy. I am on vision. I'm not on task. We constantly, if we become primary caregivers, get pulled into the urgent and not the important. Do you understand the difference? Okay. All right, so let's talk about another barrier. 2 parish models, chapel or daddy. Which one's better, do you think? Any guesses? Chapel or dad? Chapel. Okay, someone says chapel. Let's talk about chapel. In the chapel paradigm, and you can probably identify your parish really quickly if you're a chapel paradigm, here's the deal. You've got a few key families or a few key persons, and the priest and the church is viewed as their personal chapel. It's supposed to operate based on what they want. So usually small churches are chapels, like under 50 people. So when I arrived at my church, 6 families, it was a chapel. The parish council president told me, here's when we want services. Here's what we want you to do. And he, along with the other 5 founding families, had clear ideas of what they wanted. Okay? It's not a healthy paradigm. Many of our churches, regardless of size, are still that way. I talked to some of you yesterday, and you were discussing your parish. Says, oh, that's a chapel. What do you mean? I said, well, you have a few key people who control the life of the parish. And God forbid if we don't do what they ask, right? Now, the second one, who thinks it's daddy now? You're afraid to raise your hands, aren't you? Because I got more slides. Okay, in the daddy model, in this model, we typically have a charismatic or incredibly capable central leader. And they control all aspects of parish life. And lots of us priests like this model. In this model, people say, what does Father say? Did Father approve this? Was he at the meeting? You'll be shocked to find out I attend very few of my ministry meetings anymore. This is not a good model. But a lot of our parishes are still based on this, right? And as long as that charismatic figure is going, we're good. As soon as they're gone, we're in trouble. Now, some people combine the two. They get the daddy chapel hybrid going. That's really funky. So then you got this charismatic leader, and he's really catering to these key people, right? Okay, let's talk about the paradigm we need to go to. It's called empowered. Again, most of this is not mine. Some of it I've tweaked based on stuff I've read and the experiences I've had. But this model for our communities is what we need to work towards and implement. It's the healthiest and best suited for outreach and evangelism. What is this paradigm like? In this paradigm, community leaders take responsibility for the health and life of the parish. So you've got to diagnose yourself and say, where are we? We a chapel? We a daddy? We don't want to be either. We need to get to empowered. But a couple things have to happen if you're going to do this. And we're going to talk about some of those in a minute. But your ministries can't be micromanaged by the few key people or the daddy. The parishioners have to know what your vision and mission and strategy is. And they have to have had that communicated to them so that they can align themselves with it. Their work has to actually be honored. Not only do we say you're responsible, but we actually let them be responsible for the life of the parish. Now, it's scalable. It's healthy. It brings new life. And you'll stop hearing, oh, that family wanted this, so we did the following. Or Father said we should, and so we did. All that goes away. Some of us might feel a little bit uneasy with this idea, right? Our next barrier, I call it leadership progression. We'll put the slide up. I couldn't figure out how to make this slide come up in parts. But, as I said, we have this leadership training program that goes on in our parish, and I myself have continued to work on my own leadership skills. And I want to talk to you very quickly about this, because it's essential. Father Theodore brought it up. You've got to have a great leader in your community, and he's got to be a priest. But that priest has to really understand what leadership's about. Okay? The first bullet that forms the basis for leadership is character. And that might sound like, okay, yeah, we got that one. No, we don't. Do we truly have character established in our leaders? What is character? I'm going to define it for you. Character is knowing the difference between right and wrong. Okay, well, that should seem easy enough. We know the difference between right and wrong. Well, here's the hard part. A true leader who has character acts for what is right regardless of the risk to themselves. They're a servant leader. That's why the icon of Christ the servant leader is there. He does what's right regardless of the risk to himself. If you're operating in fear, you don't do this, right? You make your excuses, you blame, you get angry, all that happens. Okay, the second thing is once that we have established the fact that we know what the difference is between right and wrong, that we're going to act for what is right, we're going to teach everybody else to do the same, then we have to have a vision. And if you start to look at leaders in our communities, they may have one or two, but they don't have all three. And the one that they absolutely can't be missing is character, but they have to have vision. This is that one-sentence dream that you've communicated regularly to your community that they all understand, that they can repeat. It's a mantra. So in our parish, we have this phrase, an Orthodox community where people find transformation in Jesus Christ. It's the vision. They all know that. If you start talking, if you hear them in the coffee hour, oh, Father's vision is that we are going to be transformed in Jesus Christ. They know it, and that that's what's going to happen in this community. And we have to communicate that regularly. The third thing is we have to be competent. We have to actually know what we're doing. And if we don't, we have to develop the skills. So we have Sunday school teachers, they're leaders. They may have character. They may have a vision, but are they competent? Have we trained them? No, we haven't. Same thing with parish council leaders, ministry leaders. Just because someone says, I want to do something, doesn't mean they should be doing something. Isn't that true? And you don't think about it. So what we do is we define roles and responsibilities in our parish council, and we don't just say at a parish assembly, who wants to run? We've already talked to people in the community who have the skills that we need, and we've asked them to put themselves forward. So we have to develop competency. And then what happens when all of that occurs is the trust. Someone earlier was saying, well, how is it that someone's going to, catch what you're trying to sell, Father? And it's by building up these three. The same with all the other leaders in our community. Next one. Now, this is the hardest slide for me to go through because it's the most complex. Let's say that you've tilled the soil. You've bought into this premise of, okay, we got to unlock barriers. You've prepared your community. You've examined your motivations, and you've really overcome the idea that you're operating in fear. You've bought into the idea that you can't have a primary caregiver being the priest or just a few handful of leaders. You've got the right parish model that you're moving towards. It's empowered. Well, you've even developed leaders. You've developed yourself. The next thing that you have to have is a strategic plan. And this is how you go about building one. This is a complicated slide. This framework builds that transcendent structure. I told you we're going to be talking about forms, right? But if you don't have this in place, trust me, the growing parishes do. They're clear. Is your parish clear? So let's talk about it. Step one, clarify your identity. Now, this seems at first ridiculous. But if you do not get people's oars in the water at the same time, what happens? Their energy and effort is dissipated. If I go in first, then someone else goes in third, and someone else in fifth, and everybody's disjointed, the boat doesn't move. The energy, they're rowing just as hard as the parish is growing. Are your people not working hard? But they're not getting anywhere. Because decision-making in your parish is not clarified. They don't know what they're working towards. They don't know where to go. So decisions end up getting warehoused. After a while, people say, just take the oars out of the water. I have no idea where we're going. So you've got to establish your vision and your mission, the why and the how. So this is how we did it at Saint Spyridon. We said our vision is an Orthodox community where people find transformation in Jesus Christ. How are we going to do that? 4 things: worship, service, community, education. Done. Now, we didn't collaborate. You gave me 5 principles. You gave 5 same ones, right? You've got to clarify your identity. The next step is you do what's called a SWOT: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You sit down with those who are really engaged in the life of the parish, and you begin to ask them questions that look at your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats. You categorize them, and you understand honestly who you are. You have strengths. You have weaknesses. You have opportunities, and you have threats. You've got to be aware what they are. From that, you develop an organizational chart that defines the roles and responsibilities of the parish. Does this seem like Greek to you? No. Is this okay? All right. So you literally come up with a line chart that shows where is the priest. And we have a very defined structure, right? We know our metropolitans here. We know the priest is assigned. We know that the parish council serves at the election of the parish assembly. So that top part is really well defined for us. What happens below that? Do you know? Who reports to who? How are tiebreakers overcome? What's someone's responsibility? And when you have gate crashers, and our parish are full of them, That's why people give up trying. So, well, I served on that committee, but, we made certain decisions and they were countermanded by this person, and we don't even know why, because nothing's defined. But when it's defined, then you as a priest, when someone comes to you and says, hey, Father, can you get involved in X, Y, Z? You say, you know what? No, that's not under me. That's under this. Talk to them first. The fourth thing that you do, and the fourth thing seems a little bit backwards because actually number 5 relates to number 4, but you've got to do 4 first. And that is, you look at developing long-range strategic goals that move you firmly toward your vision and mission. So I'll give you an example of a long-range strategic goal in my parish. Enhance each person's relationship with Jesus Christ and one another through our focused ministries of worship, community, service, and education that enrich the internal and external community. Back to what Father Luke was saying. It's not just inward focus, right? We're looking at ourselves and we're looking out into the community. Once you've done that, then you develop 3 to 5 of those, no more. 3's good. We only have 3. You go on to your SMART goals. And a SMART goal is the more granular stuff that gets you to work toward your long-range strategic goals. And SMART is an acronym. It stands for specific, so the goal has to be specific. It has to be measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound. So let me give you a SMART goal. Develop ministry plans and guidelines by the end of March 2017. It's a SMART goal. It's specific, it's measurable, it's actionable, it's realistic, and time-bound. And then you can assign the role and responsibility portion because you already did your chart. So for our community, the leader of that is the director of ministries, who reports to the proistomenos. And the execution of it is the ministry leaders. Step 6, down here at the bottom, is you implement the plan. Otherwise, it's just a sheet of paper. And Father Theodore, I noticed you guys have yours out. So is this something that you socialize constantly with the community? The strategic plan? Oh, you're in the middle of yours. Okay. So you implement this, and then you go through annual reviews, and it's only going to last about 5 years. And then you're on to the next set. We're almost done. Last set of barriers, or second to last set, is lots of meetings and events that go nowhere and fail to serve the vision and the mission of the parish. Activity doesn't equal accomplishment. And sometimes what we fail to do after we've got all this worked out is bring everything into alignment with our vision and mission. We get off the rails. And the main thing is not the main thing. So do you know all of those yacht clubs on the East Coast? Do you know what those were started as? Life-saving stations. They're now private yacht clubs. They no longer save lives. They're for the rich and the famous. We can get off track. And it usually happens because as leaders, we lack reflective thinking. What we start to do is get back to just digging ditches. We like the tasks. That's easier. And if you remember earlier, we talked about helicopter A, helicopter B. A is on task, B is on vision. You've got to stay on vision. And so I went to this leadership retreat. And we had gone through a lot of these ideas. And at the end, we were each given a task to build a sandcastle. They divided us up into teams. And they gave us a set of guidelines. My team leader got to the box and he said, excuse my French, he said, the sheet, it was a secular event. He says, let's just build the damn thing. I was like, time out. We're just going to do the task? We do that all the time. We write up the strategy. We get the vision crafted, the mission, and then we just abandon it. We go right back to digging ditches. So as a leader, you've got to reflectively think. One of the things that what I do is if I've got a day of meetings, I schedule a half hour in the morning after prayer to sit and think about the meetings I'm going to have. I want to know already, before I get into the meetings, what I want to accomplish. I don't want to just get into the meeting and shoot from the hip all the time. The second thing that happens is that we fail to leverage. We fail to leverage our resources. And one of the ways that we can remedy that is develop a cadence chart. So what's a cadence chart? Well, if you've identified the leaders that we talked about earlier and you've aligned them with your vision and mission, and you're not micromanaging them, but leading them, then what you do is you develop this cadence chart by developing your parish life into your mission statement. So for us, it's worship, education, service, community. And here I added admin, because as a parish priest, I still have some admin functions. And in my cadence chart, I basically look at everything and I say, okay, what's my span of control? What am I, according to my org chart, really to be watching? And it can't be more than 7 areas. If it is, then you're back to the primary caregiver being the priest. And you classify the degree of oversight. I need to meet with the worship leaders, so my choir director, my lead chanter, altar boy, altar guide, all that. I need to meet with them how often? Once a month. My community ministries, they're almost all annually or biannually. So I've got a knitting group, I've got a dinner group, we've got a men's fellowship group, we've got all these other community fellowship groups, right? And I don't need to meet with them monthly. And when they ask me, Father, can we meet again? I said, no. We'll go through your annual review in September like we do. We'll talk about things that, if something urgent and important comes up and we need to talk, contact me. Right? So we classify the degree of oversight. Some of them might be quarterly. Some might be weekly. So my staff, my key staff, I meet with them every week. And we set those times up. I guess I've already talked about that with the key personnel. Now again, remember, you're leading the leaders. That's leverage. That gets you away from being the primary caregiver. The other thing that happens that becomes a barrier for us is that we don't have accountability. We send everybody off, but we really don't know who's doing what when. And so we've got to refer back to our long-range strategic goals, our SMART goals, our roles and responsibilities. And when we meet with our leaders, we always do, I call it the dashboard. I sit down with them and say, okay, let's go through the dashboard. Let's go through your long-range strategic goals. Let's go through your SMART goals. Let's talk about your deliverables. Now, this all seems like crazy talk, right? But remember, I'm saying we don't want O-ring disasters. And it gets everybody doing what they need to do and gets them doing it when they should be doing it. And they love it because they don't come in and it's just a shotgun approach. They know when I meet with Father, this is what we're going to go through. And if you want, you can email me. I'll send you. I have the same agenda for all of my key personnel. What we talk about is different. Obviously, it tweaks. They have input in it. But they know there's a cadence, there's a rhythm. People start to know what's going to happen in the parish when, how things are moving. It's getting the flywheel that he talks about in Good to Great moving. Now, one thing I want to go back to really quick. Up here I said identify your span of control. I just have a suggestion. I think the span of control for a priest is preach, teach, and pray. It's really 3 things. But you can choose to add more to that if you want. All right, let's talk about practical obstacles. Can you see this advertisement down here in the bottom? I arrived at Saint Spyridon's, and there were 6 families. And the first day I showed up for liturgy, there was a big blue and white banner on the front of the church that said, Greek Church. And then there were Greek flags in the lawn, on the tables. And the first day I arrived, the few children that we have, same thing, it was like 4 children. We were in Fustanella's. So one of the key personnel, of the chapel model, I approached them and I, very quietly, discreetly talked to them. Do you think we could kind of remove some of the sort of ethnic focus? Father, this is a Greek church. And I said, have you ever been to a Korean Presbyterian church? And he said, no, it's for Koreans. Okay. So what's a Greek Orthodox church for? Yeah, Greeks, right? So we've got these practical barriers. We're going to get to this one in a little bit, but let me talk about some of them really quick. So facility, this has been touched upon. You've got an 80% problem. You cannot overcome this barrier. Once you're at 80%, you're done. You're not growing anymore. You've plateaued. There are things you can do to help utilize the facility in a more efficient way, and you can look at that. But if you're in a parish where you're saying, gosh, we're just not seeing any meaningful health or growth, and we're just talking about numbers, you've probably hit that 80% rule. And there are outliers. Some people are way past that, like here. You're parking on the medians, double loading in the load zone. I'm in the same thing. We had a parish that by fire code could fit 60. We'd get 220 people in there. It was a circus car. People would be like, where are they coming from? They just, literally, it was like being in Africa. I've been to those churches, right? They're just packed. But that can only last for so long. The second practical thing is, believe it or not, parking is one of your biggest problems. You can get 2.3 people per parking space. You can test it. It's all over. The research is solid. And parishes face this all the time. The third thing is bathrooms, women first. If the women's bathroom is smelly and dirty and ugly, people don't come back. It's the first place they check. Now, I only put this up because you have to start to think about some of these practical obstacles. You walk in. You know how many times I visit parishes and they're dirty? The books are misaligned. You know, my parish, they laugh at me. You know, one guy said, I think you're OCD. So I asked one of my altar servers, who actually had been diagnosed with OCD, I said, hey, Daryl, do you think I'm OCD? He said, no, Father. You don't feel morally compelled to clean, do you? I said, no. He says, what is it for you? And I said, I think it's just right. And he goes, yeah, then you're just tidy. But, you know, we don't think about these practical details. And we need to. When people walk in the church, right, the second thing up here is a recent Pew study showed, I mean, this is a really interesting study, and I've got the article if people want it, I can send it to you. But it actually is the first study that goes against all the research that we've seen so far that says that religiosity in America is declining. Spirituality. This research study that was recently done says absolutely not. It's actually the opposite. But why people aren't going to church is convenience. This is the #1 reason people are citing. It just doesn't fit in my schedule. Okay, so we can cry about that all we want, or we can figure it out. There are things we can do. You know, I remember one bishop told me, he said, well, it doesn't matter if people are in church. You do the service. Well, okay, I get that at some level. But doesn't it matter that people can come to church when we have church? So, like, for example, we stream all of our services. Is that a problem? So if someone can't come to church and they're at work, they can see the service. They can stream it. One day I got out of church, I went back to my office, and it was a weekday service, and I preached for like 35 minutes. Usually my sermons are 8 to 10 minutes on Sunday. But if you come on a weekday, hey, you meant to come. So I'm going to preach. So I get back. I said, oh, I'm sorry, my sermon's very long. I got back after the fellowship, because we always do fellowship after every liturgy, no matter when or every service. I got in. There was an email from Ecuador. Father, I thought the sermon was just the right amount of time. So we've got to find ways to make it practically available for people to come. The third thing is all these exotic terms we have, Orthodox, Russian, Greek, Romanian. We might like them, but people don't know what they are. It's just exotic weird. What's wrong with Saint Spyridon? Just Saint Spyridon. And you can have the logo, Greek Orthodox Church of America, Ecumenical Patriarchate, okay? Sorry. But it's a barrier. We've got to figure it out. I mean, I don't know what to do. I know that we're required by the UPR to have Greek Orthodox Church. I got nothing about being Greek. I've got a Greek wife. I really like her. But it's odd, and as Father Theodore was pointing out, someone walks in the first time. People come to my parish all the time. They've read Lasky, Stanislaw. Where was, 3 years ago? They've streamed liturgies. They've done it all. They show up, and they don't know how to pray. They don't know how to do a prostration. They've never fasted. And they walk into our churches, and everything's so foreign and so different. And we have all these practical barriers, and we've got to figure it out. All right, how much time do I have left? I have 30 minutes. So we're going to go to questions, but before I do that, I want to talk about practical things. I've got tons of ideas in my head. I know that we're going to have some panel discussion, so I'm going to leave 30 minutes for practical questions. But let me just breeze through a couple of very great resources for you, just to give you an idea of what you can have. So this one is a ministry, St. Nectarius Education Fund. There are 5 schools, 1,300 students on an annual basis. My parish is engaged and involved. It's something that Bishop Athanasios and I started. This is something your parish can do practically. You start that outreach and evangelism, as Father Luke was saying. On our podcast home, if you know anything about our podcast library, there's thousands of hours of resources on here. But you can leverage that. You can just simply create the link and make it your own, right? We've developed all sorts of educational resources. A Pascha Passport, does anybody know about this program? Last year, we sold 5,000 units. I mean, we've even got confession booklets for the disabled so that children who cannot read or speak can point and can confess. That's available. We're doing a whole new curriculum, which some of you maybe have visited this in conjunction with the Metropolis of Denver. We started an online wiki site for lesson plans, Orthodox Catechism project. You can literally just type in Holy Trinity, and all the lessons with Holy Trinity come up. You can put second grade in, it gives you the whole year's curriculum. Of course, Ancient Faith Radio. I think that's it. So let's go back. I'm happy to take practical questions at this point.
Let's thank Father Evan for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.